Need guitar in the monitor? I'm not hearing anything in the monitor. Bring it up. Yeah. That's good. Check, check. Now then, the microphone. Check, 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 check. Check 1, 2. That's good. Texas, my Texas. Mm-hmm. Now, I'm only getting one side of this, but that's fine. On the vocals and guitar? On either one of them. They're both just coming out of the right ear. Yes, just one ear. I'll just use the one. That's fine. Okay.
I don't know each one of these. All right. Are we good? All right, everybody, welcome. Good evening. It's 7 o'clock. It is time for us to begin. If everybody would come on in and grab a seat tonight. We're so grateful that you are here. Welcome. Begin to migrate in from the lobbies, if you will. All right. Well, good evening, everybody. We're going to go ahead and we're going to get started tonight. Welcome to Wise County Conservatives meeting for, what are we, May? It's May, yes. There we go. Welcome to May. All right. If we would, we're going to open with a word of prayer before I hand it over to Wesley. I believe that's the correct agenda. Is that right, Amanda? Where's she at? Oh, there you are. There you go. Okay. If you wouldn't mind, stand with me while we pray real quick, and we'll just open up with a word of prayer. Father, we thank you that you are good, and we're so grateful that we serve a good God. Lord, I say this all the time. You could have chosen to have been anything. You could have chosen to have been a tyrant. You could have chosen to have been cruel, yet you chose to be kind, and you chose to be good, and you chose to be called Father. And we're so grateful for that. Thank you that we can call ourselves your children. Father, I just pray tonight that your wisdom would be upon us, that your Holy Spirit would guide us, that we'd be led into all truth. And Father, we also lift up these United States of America. We ask you, Father, for courage, conviction, and sound leadership led and directed by the Holy Spirit. We thank you for the state of Texas. We thank you so much for this beautiful place that we call home. And we ask you, Lord, to bless the state of Texas. God bless Texas. God bless Wise County. I pray for a tremendous move of your Holy Spirit in every single area, in education, in governance, and business, throughout our churches, all throughout our community. I pray, Lord, that your kingdom come, your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. In Jesus' name we pray. Everybody say, amen. You may be seated. Yes?
No, stay standing. Don't sit. Okay, I'm not getting any guitar or vocal in the monitor here. You got it? We just won't use that. Hold on. We'll just do away with that. And we'll just listen to the house. Here we go. Texas, our Texas, all hail the mighty state. Texas, our Texas, so wonderful, so great. Boldest and grandest, withstanding every test. Oh, empire wide and glorious, you stand supremely blessed. God bless you, Texas, and keep you brave and strong, that you may grow in power and love throughout the ages long. God bless you, Texas, and back it up one slide. When you get to the chorus, you got to leave it there twice. God bless you, Texas, and keep you great and strong, that you may grow in power and worth throughout the ages long. There you go. Texas, our Texas, your freedom's single star sends out its radiance to nations near and far. Emblem of freedom, it sets our hearts aglow with thoughts of San Jacinto and glorious Alamo. God bless you, Texas, and keep you brave and strong, that you may grow in power and worth throughout the ages long. God bless you, Texas, and keep you brave and strong, that you may grow in power and worth throughout the ages long. Texas, dear Texas, from tyrant grip now free, shines forth in splendor your star of destiny. Mother of heroes, we come your children true, proclaiming our allegiance, our faith and love for you. God bless you, Texas, and keep you brave and strong, that you may grow in power and worth throughout the ages long. God bless you, Texas, and keep you brave and strong, that you may grow in power and worth throughout the ages long.
Okay. All right. That's so much better. Please stand and say your name, all the folks that are precinct chairs or county chairs. All right. Yeah, go for it. 1 month, right, Mike? All right. Whoop. All right, that is freaking awesome. Okay, next slide. All right, elected officials. Anybody elected officials? Generally no. Okay. Hey, go ahead, Caleb. All right, and so any candidates that are running for the May 7th election, please come up here and we'll give you, up to 30 seconds. We have a full house tonight, so try to keep to 30 seconds.
Hello, I'm Paul Platt. I'm running for Bridgeport ISD School Board Place 1. Vote May 7th. We got tomorrow. We've got early voting still. Secondly, lots of thanks. Thanks to the Tanners, the Hoppers, anyone who supported me. Thank you. I appreciate it. It's been tough, but it's been good. So vote May 7th.
Good job, Paul. If I could vote for you, I would. Bill Cook, I'm running for mayor in the city of Aurora. It's been kind of a battle. There's a real organized Facebook mob that's out to get us and spreading bad information. I'm not using the buzzwords. But I've had tremendous support from the Wise conservatives. Got their endorsement. It's huge. It's a blessing to me. And I doubt anybody here votes to Aurora, but I'm still going for it. So thank you.
Anybody else? Caleb, you want to say anything?
Caleb Cavanis. I'm currently sitting in Place 5, City Council of Alvord, and running again this year. So it's been a good race so far.
Thank you for running. What you got?
And also to Mike and Karen Drury. Woo!
All right, so anyone running for the May 24th Republican primary runoff, please come on up here and say a few words.
Hey. Good evening. My name is Blanca Tuma, and I'm in the primary runoff election, running for Wise County Clerk. I see a lot of your faces that have already voted for me, and I would appreciate your vote again on May 24th. Early voting is May 16th through the 20th, and I am so thankful for this amazing group, Wise County Conservatives. Without you guys, I mean, it has been a long and rough road for my family and I, and we are just so thankful to have you guys and your support, and we thank you guys so much. So.
All right, so we're going to pass the hat. Anything that you could give, it would really be appreciated. And thank you for your donations. There are actually envelopes, so you can fill that out, and then that way it can be donated effectively to our PAC. Next slide. Okay, so we are actually moving in July to Thursdays. So we have been on Mondays for well over a year now, but we are going to move to Thursdays starting in July for no other good reason than the fact that there's usually about 3 holidays a year that fall on Mondays. So I think that's going to be a good move. I think we're going to get more folks on Thursdays, so that's what we're going to do. So try to mark your calendar starting on Thursday. Start on July, we will be meeting on Thursdays at the same time, same place. Next slide. Okay, so just a reminder, we already kind of touched on this, but May 7th is our municipal election, and tomorrow actually is the last day to early vote for that. So get out and vote on the 7th. We need as big a participation as we can. That is a race that usually has epically low turnout, and we need high turnout to get the conservative voice out in Wise County. Next slide. So May 24th is actually going to be our Republican primary runoff. And so this is a pretty small ballot. These are just the few races that were not decided on March 1st. And it also involves all the precinct chair races. So that's a really important election. We have 5 contested precinct races, which I think is wonderful. We've never had those on the ballot in recent memory. So I think this is going to be a huge thing for Wise County. So next slide. Okay, so what I want to do is I want to have the distinct pleasure to introduce my friend, Lieutenant Colonel Bruce Cunningham, to come up and speak for a few minutes. He is actually just recently, we went to his retirement celebration on Saturday, had the privilege of spending the day with his family, and he just finished 34 years of proud service to our U.S. Army. And it was absolutely epically amazing to see all the things that Bruce had done over those 34 years. So I want to introduce Bruce for a minute to come introduce yourself. We're going to actually, over the next number of months, try to have every board member of Wise Conservatives come up and speak, and just so you get to know them and get to know our PAC board for Wise County Conservatives. So Lieutenant Colonel Bruce Cunningham.
Andy, I can't believe you get paid to do this because it's so much fun, right? I mean that. I had a nice retirement celebration reunion last Saturday, and Andy and his family came. It was great to have you there. The military's pretty tight. You probably know that. The older you get, the more tight they are. And I joined the Army in 1983. How many of you guys were able to vote in 1983? Well, maybe half of you. Good. Some of you have to keep your hands down to keep your age from showing. But a buddy of mine from 1985 drove down for this party, this reunion. He drove from Minnesota. So normally I don't speak from my phone, but he said, I want you to read. I got a message from him today. He said, Bruce, good afternoon. I'm back deep behind enemy lines at observation post number 1 in Minnesota. I want you to know the world sees us as the land of the free and home of the brave, Texas. And that's why I'm involved with Wise County Conservatives and with Andy in supporting this cause, is that we still have freedom here. It's not enough, and we got a lot of work to do. And the work is done at the elbow level. The precinct chairs, this is where we went. We say in the Army, a successful battle is fought and won at the sergeant to captain level. And if you don't know that, that's really where wars are fought. Generals get the recognition and the reputation, but it's fought at that level. Well, our sergeants and our captains, and that the battle is actually fought by the precinct level, at the county level. This is where we're going to turn America around. So I'm very excited to be a part of this. I'm excited to be a part of the board where I can contribute. I'm officially retired today, or actually first of the month, so I can say that I'm fully involved politically where I couldn't be before. Those of you who don't know me, I'm Married 31 years and a few months to my wife, who's not here tonight. She's counseling a young lady who's in college, our daughter, on her B. She's a perfectionist. She got a B today. She's really upset. We homeschooled for the last 23 years. My oldest is 23. She's working on her master's at Baylor. She's got a 4.0 there. The other one's trying to keep a 4.0 there. It's rough. Life is rough when you're a coach, teach, mentor for young people. But we believe in private education. We were all trained in the government schools. I've been there, done that. I was a juvenile probation officer for about 5 years in Denton County. I saw what the schools were doing back in the 1990s, and we committed to private education after that. So you fight where you are. If you're running for school board, you do the best with what you have before you. I hope you win. If you win, and I hope you take our battle agenda to the board and make changes for the better. What can I say about what we're doing here? This is the fight. It's been said, I don't know if you've heard this saying before, but they're the 4 boxes of freedom. Anybody know what the 4 boxes of freedom are? The First Amendment is what? The soapbox. All right. The jury box that decides the rightness of laws. The ballot box when you vote, and we're working in that area right now, right? And we have some restrictions on the freedom of speech today, social media, what we can say and get away with, and where we can say it. So we've got some restrictions on the soapbox, the ballot box, the jury box, but the last one is the cartridge box, and our goal is to keep it out of the cartridge box, because that's last, and that's it. And we don't want to go there if we don't have to. We want to win there if we have to, but my point is, and I'm a soldier, I don't want to go there. So let's keep it, let's win at the ballot box, let's win at the soapbox, let's win where we are so we can keep it there, and that's kind of my simple philosophy after 34 years of playing Army. And that's really all I have tonight. If I've got any questions afterwards, I'm happy to chat over how we can contribute, and if I can take your input, we'd love to do so as a board member. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, sir. All right, so it's my pleasure to introduce our speaker tonight. Tim Hardin is the CEO of Texans for Fiscal Responsibility. This is an outstanding organization that, among other things, actually gives an incredible rating for our legislators. In most cases, that rating is not incredible at all. And our legislators hate this man. So I would like to introduce Tim Hardin.
Hey, everyone. Remind me, are we going to 8 or 8:30? What's the time so I know?
So you have 45 minutes.
Okay, perfect. Okay. Hello, my name is Tim Hardin. I am President and CEO of Texans for Fiscal Responsibility. You can go ahead and slide forward. So I'm not going to read our long mission statement. I'll just tell you briefly what we do. How many of y'all are familiar with Texans for Fiscal Responsibility? Okay, about half. We've been around for about 10 to 12 years, maybe a little longer, 2005, 2006. And essentially our flagship is the Fiscal Responsibility Index. And so what we focus on is fiscal and size of government issues, and we pay attention specifically to the state legislature, the state house, and the state senate, and we rate representatives and senators based on how they vote. So we try to be a resource to taxpayers. We used to be under an organization called Empower Texans. TFR was actually started by Michael Quinn Sullivan, if y'all have ever heard of him before. We have since detached, and we are a completely independent organization. That happened in end of 2020. And we still have our flagship of the Fiscal Responsibility Index. We also have started trying to help grassroots through education and transparency. We have a big policy plan that we're about to introduce in the next 2 or 3 weeks. We're waiting on a few things, but we're trying to push some resolutions through the Republican Party of Texas platform. And if you will visit texastaxpayers.com, that is our website. You can go, there's a little tab that says Index. You can look up your lawmakers, how they've done. We have a little section on news where we do, a couple of articles every week. We also have a newsletter that goes out once a week if y'all are interested in keeping up to date. But our main focus is going into the legislative session, which will be January 2023, and we're going to be pushing 3 very specific items that I'll probably talk about at the end. But that is essentially what we do. Next slide. The organization consists of just 2 of us. So myself and Jeremy Kitchen, he is also an experienced legislative staffer. So him and myself, I was chief of staff for 8 years for Representative Jonathan Stickland. If y'all have ever heard of him before, it's kind of a fireball. He retired in 2021. And so I exited and came over to the organization. Jeremy has worked for a few legislators about the same amount of time as me, about 8 years. So we have about 15 years. We know the ins and out of that building, what really happens behind closed doors, what the legislators tell you, and what actually happens. And so we're trying to bring that knowledge to the organization and just provide more transparency to everyone. Policy goals. So I'm not going to concentrate on those. I'm going to talk about our plan that we're about to release, which is, we're calling it the TPP, which is the Texas Prosperity Plan. There's a number of fiscal issues that we will be supporting, but we're going to be pushing 3 specifically. One is banning taxpayer-funded lobbying. This is something that I believe in the 2020 Republican primary passed with over, I think, 95%. This is essentially where lobbyists are hired by local governments. They use your tax dollars to go to Austin and then advocate to take more of your tax dollars. It is immoral. It is a major, major problem. The biggest lobby group in the state is Hilco Partners. They partner with a number of different localities, and some of the biggest lobby firms are taxpayer funded. A lot of people don't know that. That's one. 2 is going to be the elimination of property taxes. We've wrote extensively about that. You know, we get a lot of feedback on that, but what a lot of people don't realize is what's going on right now with the state budget. We actually just had a Ways and Means hearing that deals with the tax code in the House. The controller was estimating about $12.5 billion surplus. They underestimated our revenue. They just came out and said, actually, we underestimated again. It's going to be more, probably like $15 billion in surplus. We have about $13 billion in COVID money that is unallocated. We also have about $13 billion in the rainy day or ESL fund. So a combination of close to $40 billion in surplus. Our biennial budget is about $265 billion. And so what we've been advocating for, and a number of other taxpayer organizations, including TPPF, which is a think tank in Austin, conservative think tank, is saying, hey, we have the surplus. So instead of taking the surplus dollars and turning it into a slush fund or spreading it around and growing government, how about we take that surplus and give it back to its rightful owners, the taxpayers, through property tax relief? How many of y'all's bills went up this last go around? Whew. It's looking real rough. And the crazy thing is in 2019, they were bragging about the historical property tax reform that was passed. Did any of y'all feel that? Oh, you would be mistaken to go talk to a lawmaker because they'd tell you how great it was and how it fixed all the problems. But the reality is all we have done, and this is reminiscent of everything we do in fiscal policy, is we slow the growth. So they slow the growth of our taxes, but we never get relief or reform. But yet we still keep electing these people. So that's the second plank. And the third plank, I'm not going to go 100% into, but it's the same premise. It's what we're calling a no-growth budget. So we passed a pretty historic reform this last go-around. Senator Kelly Hancock passed a spending limit that limits it to inflation, our budget growth, to inflation and population growth. They use a formula there, which we've been advocating for over a decade. The problem is when we ask conservatives, is the government too big? What's y'all's answer? Yes. Yeah. So why are we letting government grow at all? Is the real question. We've never had a revenue problem. We've always had a spending problem. If we want things like property tax relief, it is absolutely possible, especially this go around. We're going to have even more revenue. Inflation is probably going to hit double digits, is my guess, unless something changes this in the next couple months. And so I would expect our budget, it's at $265. I'm assuming it's going to be around $300 billion. Does anybody know what our budget was in 2000, 20 years ago? $98 billion. So we've almost tripled our state budget in the last 20 years. So we do not have a revenue problem. We have a spending problem, and the best way to deal with this, we've been trying for forever on the micro level to deal in budgetary committees and try and make small changes. And most of us in kind of our Liberty circles like, enough. Government is too big. It needs to stop. Let's freeze the budget where it's at and force lawmakers to cut all of the corporate welfare programs and the billions and billions of dollars that are wasted. And so you'll hear more about that. Hopefully I can make it back out here in the next month or two and do a presentation on that. Next slide. Next slide, we'll skip a couple of these so I'll make sure. Okay, so we're going to get right into the presentation here. And so tonight we're going to be talking about the principles of the free market, specifically capitalism versus socialism. Some of y'all might not have had this since you're in high school, Economics 101. So we're going to kind of go back there and talk about why capitalism tends to work and why communism or socialism has never worked. Never worked. So let's get started. So capitalism, we're going to go ahead and start with definitions. So capitalism, and this is kind of my personal definition of it, is an economic and political system in which a country's trade and industry are controlled by private owners for profit rather than by the state. Next slide. So where do we get the idea of capitalism? Well, for the most part, it starts with a man named Adam Smith. He writes The Wealth of Nations in 1776, a very famous year, same year that the U.S. Was founded. So the government, the basic idea behind it is that government interference in the market stifles competition and economic growth. And he introduced the concept of laissez-faire policy into many capitalist nations, including the United States. Does anybody remember what laissez-faire policy is? Off the top of your head, anybody brave enough? Hands up. That's a very good definition. So it's French for allow to do. So basically let the market figure it out. It's a very good, usually what I mention is if we would have had a laissez-faire policy with COVID-19, we'd probably be in a lot different situation than we are now, because it just seems like everything that the government tried to do, whether it's masks or vaccines, none of it worked. All it did was result in pulling liberties from individuals, and the virus is going to burn its way through the population despite what we did. And so the laissez-faire policy allows for things to take their natural course without interference. And it's the core idea behind pure capitalism. And I want y'all to note that I'm saying pure capitalism because tonight we're going to be talking about capitalism. We don't really have pure capitalism in the United States. I'm sure a lot of y'all are aware of that. And so we're going to have some caveats as we kind of define these. But for laissez-faire policy to work, go back real quick. It requires capitalism, free market economy, and rational market theory. And so we'll explain rational market theory. You can go to the next one. Essentially, and you could talk about this forever, but very simplistically, it is the market is always right. A free market is always right, meaning, we have this supply and demand and their inverse relationship, but essentially, the market equilibrium is always going to find the right price that people are willing to pay. It's only when government sticks their nose in our business that we have problems. We have problems. And so an unmanipulated supply and demand dictate what the fair price of a product or service is. That's essentially the basis behind rational market theory. So why is competition good for an economy? Young, shout it out. Makes it stronger. Would you say? It does. It makes better products. What else? Lower prices. Anything else? That's a great one. It allows bad businesses to die, right? Which is actually necessary, which is a problem because our government tends to do what? Bail out bad businesses that should have died. You can go to the next slide. So by increasing competition, we increase supply of products and services, thereby lowering prices. We increase the need for innovation. If you're making a widget and another company knows how to make a better widget at a lower price, this encourages them to do so because they can outsell you and maybe even put you out of business. This obviously improves products and services. Weak and inefficient companies are put out of business, which is exactly what should happen. This raises the bar for the market. And the example I came up with is, and this is not a perfect example, but is cell phones and medicine, right? And so for the most part, when we look at the tech of a cell phone, for instance, I think I have mine on me. I have one of these new phones that we're going back to the flip phones. So I have a little touch screen. And so we've had a lot of innovation. If y'all remember when the iPhone was first created, in the early 2000s, 2005 or something like that, we have come a very, very long way. And it's not that we don't have regulation, but there's far less regulation on the cell phone market than there is the medical market. Another example would be medicine. I myself am a diabetic. My father was type 1. He was diagnosed in the 80s. And when I look at how much progress we've made, there hadn't been that much progress. My dad had a glucose monitor. He injected insulin. As far as we've got is now I have one that works with my cell phone, and there's pumps, that you can attach to yourself, but it's essentially the exact same thing. And I'm sure you've heard about insulin prices, how bad insulin prices are. This is a direct result of government manipulation and government regulation. As a matter of fact, I'm pretty sure that Trump had done something to try and lower insulin, and then like day one, Biden comes in and is like, nope, jack it back up. Woo. And you can make this case for a lot of medicine. I'm a firm believer that if we took a lot of regulation off medicine and allowed the free market to work, we would probably have a lot of cures for a lot of diseases, and we would have made a lot more progress with a lot of this because we don't have the government sticking their nose in our business. So, capitalism summary. Government controls, bad. The free market is good. Next slide. So, socialism. So this is a little bit more tricky than capitalism because this word is used a lot by a lot of people. And if we look at the historical definition, this is what it is. It is a transitional social state between the overthrow of capitalism and the realization of communism. Socialism is not a form of government, and socialism is not an economic system. Where do we get this definition? We'll go to the next slide. So before we get to Marx, we will look at the first idea really of socialism, at least in print and history, is Plato's Republic. And Plato's Republic envisioned a society, if you've probably heard the phrase philosopher kings, a society that was run by enlightened philosopher kings. And essentially, everyone was caste. So, you were chosen what you were going to do from birth, and it was complete state control, controlled by enlightened individuals that would basically control the means of production. It's not exactly the same thing that Marx advocated for, but it's very close. Now, modern socialism, what we typically think of when we think of modern socialism, comes from the Communist Manifesto. I'm sure a lot of y'all have heard of that. The main idea, or the kind of thesis in there, is that the history of all existing society is the history of class struggles. Does that sound familiar? We're still talking about class struggles right now, whether it's gender or race or this or that. The left uses this constantly to pit classes against one another. And Marxism has infiltrated almost every single aspect of our country, including a lot of conservative ideas. Now, the book includes how capitalism would be replaced by socialism. The last paragraph of the book calls for the forcible overthrow of all existing social conditions. And of course, communism has caused some of the worst tragedies in history. And so it's important for us to realize that the modern conception of socialism, it was never the end point. It is a means to an end. Socialism is always meant to end capitalism and to have us arrive at communism. That is why it is not a form of government. It is a transitional period towards communism. Next slide. So some of you might have studied this, so I think it's wise to take a look at the 10 planks. I'm sure some of you have heard the 10 planks of the Communist Manifesto. And as we go through these, I want y'all to think about how many of these we have similarities in our own culture, right? The first one is the abolition of private property in land and the application of all rents of land to a public purpose. And so no private ownership. Where would we see that today in our society? Ooh, bam. Yes, we just talked about that. So if we pay perpetual property taxes to the government, despite, I'm sure some of you have even paid off your home, and I assume you continue to have to pay property taxes, what would happen if you stopped paying those property taxes? They're gonna come get your house. Do you know how long it takes for them to start the foreclosure process once you're in deferral, which is typically like, I think it's in the end of January when it's due, right? How many days, according to Texas law, before they can or they're able to start the foreclosure process? 14, somebody said. Any other guesses? 1 day. 1 day. Now, they're not forced to do that. There are examples of localities that have, but according to Texas statute, 1 day in deferral, and they can start the foreclosure process. And of course, there's a number of people who have been foreclosed upon, and it unequally affects those on fixed incomes, whether that's people who are below the poverty line, or older citizens who are on fixed incomes because of retirement. There's been a number of older individuals who have been literally pushed out of their house because they cannot afford the property taxes. And so in our opinion, it is an immoral tax, and it is a tax that prevents you from ever actually owning your property. And so this is absolutely a communist idea. We have a heavy and progressive graduated income tax. I think we all know that we have an income tax. Does anybody know when the income tax started? 1913. That's right. We're going to talk about that date. Some other exciting things happened in that year as well. But we have had this for quite a long time. It's evolved a little bit over time, but it essentially started in 1913, over a century ago. The abolition of all rights of inheritance is another one. The confiscation of the property of all immigrants and rebels. This is significant because we saw some signs and some things that have happened. Specifically, we could name January 6th, right? That we have parents who are going to school board meetings who are being labeled what? Domestic terrorists. Okay, this is purposeful, and you're going to see if they're able to continue this narrative and they're able to continue to push this, that they're going to label specifically Christian conservatives as domestic terrorists, and domestic terrorists should not be able to own land, even participate in the economy. We saw kind of flashes of that with those vaccine passports, right? It's like, if you don't have this, well, you can't buy a hamburger, you can't do this, you can't do that. So there is an absolute push to silence conservatives, to silence constitutionalists, and use any of these means to do that. 5 would be the centralization of credit in the hands of the state by means of a national bank with the state capital and in an exclusive monopoly. So we're talking about a central bank. Any guesses on when the central bank started? 1913, there's that year again, right? And what is our central bank called? The Federal Reserve. And is it actually federal? No, we all know it's a bunch of private banksters who manipulate our currency and have been manipulating our currency for a very long time. This is straight out of the Communist Manifesto. I'm sure a lot of y'all have either heard of or read The Creature from Jekyll Island. Does a very good job of explaining how this came about, and it is not a coincidence that the central bank and our income tax and a lot of other shitty things happened at the same time. Next slide. So, number 6 is going to be the centralization of the means of communication and transportation at the hands of the state. And so when this was created, I believe we basically had radio. TV wasn't even around. This is mid-1800s. But we have created an organization. Does anybody know what that is called in the United States that regulates communication? The FCC, that's right. And right now, we kind of mentioned it earlier, what are conservatives being censored on, which is the public square right now? Facebook, social media, right? We had good old Elon Musk come through and try, and we'll see what happens. I mean, I'm not going to hold my breath, but he's supposed to take over Twitter, and he's promising to preserve free speech. We will see. It's encouraging. I think we should encourage that, and that is absolutely a private solution to a public problem. And it's very telling that the day after he announced the purchase of Twitter, that the Biden administration came out and said, hey, we're going to create this ministry of truth to combat disinformation. Don't worry, it's just for foreign governments. It's not for anything else, but we have a problem with censorship. And yet again, when we allow the government to put their grubby hands on free speech, decide what's truth and what is not truth, we're going to get into kind of how they've changed that, and it involves Twitter and private companies and the concept of fascism we'll talk about here in a minute. But that is another modern day example. 7, the extension of factories and instruments of production owned by the state. Some of these aren't as, we've moved a lot of our industry and manufacturing out of the United States. So some of these are a little dated. We don't have as many. We have the equal obligation of all to work, the establishment of industrial armies, especially for agriculture. 9 is the combination of agriculture with manufacturing industries, a gradual abolition and distinction between town and country by a more equitable distribution of the population. Does anybody remember about 10 years ago when everyone was talking about, was it Agenda 21 with the UN? And so it was this plan to move people from rural and shove them all into cities and control the population and where people were allowed to live. Do we know who is right now actively buying up farmland and is the largest owner of farmland right now in the United States? Our good friend, Bill Gates, is buying up farmland. None of this is accident. This is all contrived and purposeful. And so this is still going on. They just change definitions and they change what we're doing and they play the card and the shell game. But they are still trying to manipulate where the population is. In places, and specifically in cities, populations are easy to control. In the rural parts, we're not easy to control. We're spread out and they don't have as much surveillance. So 10 would be free education for all children in government schools. Why would they want to control the schools? What'd you say? Robots. Yeah. So they want to be the sole proprietor of your education or indoctrination, right? And we're not going to make the case that all public education is bad, but what we do need to acknowledge is there's a reason that governments want sole control of your education. Yes, sir.
I will point out that they are against mandatory education.
Correct.
They're
Only in favor of compulsory attendance. Explain it for me real quick.
Mandatory compulsory attendance means you have to sit there. You're required to sit there for indoctrination or whatever they want to teach you. Mandatory education, when you get out, you can't qualify to go to college. You can't pass your
Sure.
test. You can sue.
Awesome. So I can say in Texas, specifically education, we have one of the better states for education choice, right? We have one of the freest homeschooling laws in the entire nation, as well as privatization. We're making progress on charter schools. I think it's important to be able to choose your education. There's a big call because of everything that's gone on with mask policies, with vaccine policies, with all the nightmares that are going on in public education. I expect to see a push for school choice, and I expect the public education system to push back and to fight against usually labeling vouchers as bad. That's another conversation for another night. We won't have to talk about that right now. But do understand there's a reason that the government wants any level of control of education. It doesn't necessarily mean that public education is bad, but we should be wary anytime a government, especially when they do not allow other options. Next slide. So why is government regulation bad for the market? Any brave people? It's restrictive and it's not responsive to the market. It's almost the exact opposite of why competition is good. Go to the next slide. So regulation tends to pick winners and losers, and especially in the modern day, this is done through subsidies or corporate welfare. So it's tax abatements. It is essentially handing out money to influence companies to do what the government wants them to do. When the government picks winners and losers, the market is not allowed to operate correctly. It stifles competition through regulation and barriers to entry. I can say, I was talking, I can't remember, we're talking about my construction company before, and so when I was in my early 20s, I was a roofing salesman. And so I'm sure y'all love seeing those guys whenever you have a hailstorm, but that was me. I ended up starting my own roofing company after doing it for about 2 or 3 years. And as probably a lot of y'all know, if you've ever replaced your roof, you know it's pretty unregulated in Texas. So there's a lot of bad actors out there. But the one thing that I can say is I would not have been able to start the construction company that I still run to this day had we had these massive barriers to entry. Do y'all know who the biggest lobbyists for occupational licensing and regulation in industries are? It's typically the big boys. So your electricians, your plumbers, they are the ones who are typically advocating for more regulation and more barriers to entry because it stifles competition and allows them to keep hold. An example off the top of my head would be gambling. Like, I'm not advocating for gambling, but do you know who the biggest lobbyist to prevent gambling in Texas is? It's the Indian tribes in Oklahoma and Louisiana. Always has, but they actually donate to candidates to say, do not vote for gambling. Why? Because there's a lot of Texans that go there. And so this is a pretty common practice. It also, regulation suppresses innovation. We kind of talked about with medicine. And it produces fascistic policy. What do I mean by that? We have our good friend Benito Mussolini here, and he famously said that fascism should be more appropriately called corporatism because it is a merger of state and corporate power. And I think that's a really accurate definition of what fascism actually is, and we see a lot of that in our government today. Next slide. So, socialism, free market, bad. Government controls, good. Next slide. So the question, what is the United States today? Are we capitalist? Are we socialist? Any guesses? Oh, well, we got the answer right there. Y'all cover your eyes. So most economists classify us as what's called a mixed economy. And so it's an economy, in my opinion, is an economy that is in transition. Okay, we exhibit characteristics of both socialism and capitalism. We have government controls on either it partially controls or fully controls goods and services, and the market is heavily regulated, and we have lots and lots and lots of taxes. Next slide. So, and y'all take this with a grain of salt, right? This is some socialistic policies in the U.S. We'll name a few of them. One, of course, is Social Security, which is going bankrupt. I highly doubt that I will ever see any of the Social Security. We have welfare, Medicare, Medicaid, Obamacare. The minimum wage is a socialistic or communist idea. As we've seen, public schools, public universities, food stamps, public hospitals, public parks, public libraries, heavy corporate subsidies, police and fire services, Federal Reserve Bank, CPS, occupational licenses, and more. I am not saying that all of these are bad things. All I'm saying is that these agencies are produced with taxpayer income, and they are socialized. We all pay for them together. And I think a lot of those are part of the core function of government. So I'm not necessarily speaking against those, but it's good for us to at least recognize that. As far as capitalist policies, I had to kind of stretch on some of these because they're not completely true. For instance, the private property rights, like we own our property, but do we really own our property, right? Yeah, it's in your name, the deed's in your name, but in certain circumstances, if you're classified as a domestic terrorist or you don't want to pay your property taxes, that may or may not be true. Private and homeschooling, as I said, in Texas, we're pretty free, quite honestly. I don't know if a lot of y'all know this, but during the COVID pandemic in 2021, our public education system, they track the enrollment. And the enrollment in our public education system went down for the first time in Texas history since they started keeping stats, I think in the 1960s. It went down 2%. Our homeschooling numbers tripled. And this is largely based on some of the policies that parents were dealing with. Churches and charities, I know you can poke holes in that as well. Cryptocurrencies, I'm sure a lot of y'all like to talk about those. They have, for the most part, been unregulated. It's kind of the wild, wild west. It's probably a dangerous investment, but up until recently, they have been decentralized and they haven't been controlled, but now we're seeing governments, including the United States, come through and want to regulate Bitcoin, and now we're also seeing them take that technology, the blockchain technology, and we have the digital yuan that's already been created in China, and then we have the digital dollar that we're going to see here really, really soon, and they're probably not going to do good things with that. I was actually just listening to something before this that they're trying to make the digital dollars programmable, and what do we mean by that? We mean that you can literally dictate how and when you can spend these dollars. And so it's not actually currency. It's like a voucher almost, or a coupon. It's like, but if you've misbehaved, then they can literally turn off. It's worked into the code of these. So it's I would highly warn against supporting a digital dollar, and there's lots of other concerns there. But we're probably headed into dangerous territory if we adopt that as monetary policy. Unregulated parts of the internet, there still are some that exist. They're quickly disappearing. Cosmetic products, for some reason, is pretty largely unregulated. There's some regulations on them, but I think they've tried for decades to regulate them closer, but they haven't been successful. So I guess Avon and all those people have done good lobbying against that. AM radio, gun ownership. I know we got issues there as well. We did pass constitutional carry in Texas, and we've seen a number of states after Texas pass constitutional carry as well. That's something that's close to my heart. We carried that bill for 2 or 3 sessions in a row, and it finally got through this last go around. And then the nutritional supplement market. I'm sure if you've ever been to the store and you go to the supplements, what do they say? This product is not approved by the FDA, and they have tried to regulate those as well, and they've placed some on there, but they've largely been unsuccessful at complete regulation of that. Next slide. So how do we get here? So let's talk about the history. So very brief summary of how we got here. Woodrow Wilson reduced tariffs. This introduced a shortfall in government income. And there's a lot more to it than this, so don't just take me at this word. We're trying to just give a short summary. So the Income Tax Amendment was passed in 1913. This, of course, legalized the plunder of citizens' income. Next slide. And of course, as we said earlier, the Federal Reserve Bank was brought into existence in 1913. As we already said, it is not a federal organization. It is a cartel of private banks that we have given control of our monetary policy. This was the beginning of fiat currency acceptance, slowly moving us away from the gold standard, ultimately the gold standard ending in 1973. And so we took our dollar away from being tied to something tangible, and they're now pieces of paper or federal notes. And it looks like we're going to be moving away from that to going to just the ether in the digital space, and some numbers, some ones and zeros is going to be what they're trying to push currency to. I would highly advise us to fight against that. Next. So the New Deal. So after the Great Depression, Dust Bowl, FDR comes in, who is a president who's usually highly praised. And his response to the Great Depression and the policies of Hoover was the New Deal. I'm sure we've all learned about this. So FDR believed that government interference would save the economy, and he introduced a Keynesian economic theory, which is based on government intervention, specifically in monetary policy. And his new policies came in 3 different waves. So I'm not going to read all of these. We'll touch some of the highlights. So in the New Deal, the first wave in 1933, we have the Emergency Banking Act. This essentially closed banks, and then the government came in and gave the bank an exam and then gave them the okay of whether or not they can open back up again. We have the Beer and Wine Revenue Act. They taxed alcohol sales. We ended up starting the process of abandoning the gold standard. The Agricultural Adjustment Act was farm subsidies. There's lots and lots and lots of farm subsidies, farm bailouts, mainly because of the Dust Bowl, but because of the policies of FDR. We have the National Industrial Recovery Act. This introduced minimum wage, workday limits, and unions. The Gold Reserve Act prohibited the private gold ownership and doubled the price of gold. You can go to the next slide. We have the second and third waves, and we'll go through all of these, but essentially it's more farm subsidies, protecting unions, the Social Security Act, which was significant, and then state-run public housing with the Housing Act as well, and then lots and lots more farm subsidies. There's quite a bit of them. So over the next 100 years or so, we have continued to suffer what I'm calling New Deal thinking. That thinking that the government, who typically causes the problems, will be able to offer us a solution to the problems that they caused. And so the more an industry is regulated, the less competition we have, the more barriers to entry we have. Monopolies are actually typically created by government intervention, not the other way around, which is what leftists would argue against. They kill small businesses. We, of course, saw this in the COVID pandemic. Thousands of Texas businesses had to close because they were not deemed essential, and they were shut down, and people were not able to put food on their table because our government said, you're not essential, you're not worth it. Government ultimately picks winners and losers. That is the theme of the last 100 years. Next slide. So why does government overreach continue? And I'm sure most of y'all are pretty familiar with this quote from Benjamin Franklin. He who would trade liberty for some temporary security deserves neither liberty or security. And the longer I've been in government, the longer I've advocated for conservative policies, the more I've realized almost everything comes down to this. We have to either choose liberty and freedom, or we choose safety and security. That's always what's on the table. The COVID pandemic is a perfect example. They provided security, but what do we have to give up? We couldn't even come out of our house. In some states, you couldn't go and jog. You couldn't do anything because the government promised to provide security, but only at the expense of liberty. And this is that with you name the policy, this is what's on the table. You can look at gun policy, the constitutional carry, right? We can provide you security by giving regulations and not allowing certain people to own firearms, or we can have liberty, but you're not going to be as secure. And that is true. If we have more liberty, you will not be as secure. Why? Because there's bad people out there. The roofing thing is another one. There's bad actors that come in, those fly-by-night companies that come through and they take advantage of people. This is what happens with liberty. So what does it require? It requires an educated person, an educated consumer, and it requires personal responsibility. That is at the core of our government. That is why our founders said that this form of government requires a moral and Christian society, because without morality, without an objective morality that Christianity provides, this is what we get. Look around. When you have this much freedom, when we're given this much freedom, but we're not grounded in anything, and degeneracy and the decline and moral decay of society sets in, bad things happen. And we're witnessing it right now. And we have been witnessing it for quite a few decades. And so to have a constitutional republic that provides liberties and protects personal civil rights, you have to have a moral and just society where the individual is big and the government is small. If the government is big, the individual is small, and there's less responsibility. So there's also a trade-off. Responsibility correlates with liberty. The more liberty we have, the more responsibility we have on ourselves. I personally believe we live in a society that does not want responsibility. And I would say specifically the younger generation, at each generation, my generation included, has gotten worse and worse and more dependent on the government. And this is purposeful as well. Next slide. So, liberty and personal responsibility. So they're directly correlated, as I said. Texas and America have simply chosen security over freedom. That's why we're at. They would rather have security than freedom. Next slide. And so let's get into the problem of woke corporatism or woke corporations. And so as you can see, I don't know if y'all know, next month is Pride Month. And so if you're not used to seeing all of these wonderful, colorful logos, you're going to see a lot of them. I can say I think it is, we've all seen, of course, what DeSantis did, which I love. We'll talk about that in a second. But I believe it was Exxon who just came out and said we refuse to fly I think the pride flag as well, which it looks as though companies are starting to get a little more bold. So that's a good thing. But this is reminiscent of a new trend in corporations pushing leftist ideology. So this is made possible by the merging of corporate and government interests, specifically fascism. We took this. And so what we saw, specifically the Biden administration when they stepped in, is there was a number, they tried to push vaccine passports, they tried to push, mask mandates, and the most part, their response was to push back. And so how did they pivot? They pivoted by going to Google, by going to the airlines, by going to the corporations who receive what? Corporate subsidies, who are essentially owned by the government, and they say, hey, we're going to highly encourage you to fire individuals who do not take the vaccine or do not abide by the mask mandate. And so we're seeing the real life results of fascistic policy. And it's so funny that we have leftists like Antifa who call themselves anti-fascists, but support actual fascism, right? It's doublespeak. It's doublespeak. So these corporations, of course, receive corporate welfare. And this is, and you're going to see this going forward, this is their new strategy, because when the government uses the private sector to manipulate and to silence conservatives, Twitter and Facebook, it's the same thing, right? They receive subsidies. I think Facebook, they received a massive amount of subsidies from Texas. I think they're building a meta plant in Waco, I believe, and they've received millions in subsidies as well. But you're going to see the government start using these corporations to silence conservatives because they can wash their hands and say, hey, we didn't do it. Your job's just trying to be responsible. And so beware that this is going to become more and more common. Next slide. So, how we win. So, I mentioned Governor Ron DeSantis. He's not a perfect individual, but for the most part, I'm a pretty big fan of his and what he has done. And the one thing that he has done better than other governors is he has decided he's going to fight and he's going to go on offense. Where most Republicans, most conservatives shy away from that. They usually defend the status quo. They don't take bold actions like him. And very recently, within the last week, of course, he signed a bill that revoked Disney's special districts and their tax privileges and all kinds of things, which is, I can't imagine another governor in the United States that would be bold enough to do that. But what are you seeing? Well, one, you're seeing like Disney's stock price tank. You're seeing the reaction of companies like Exxon, right? They're like, yeah, we're not gonna do this. We're gonna be apolitical. And in order to stop this fascistic takeover or them trying to regulate speech, it's going to take brave and courageous politicians that are willing to not just play defense, but actively go on offense and unapologetically go on offense against these corporations, pulling their subsidies and doing what needs to be done. We could talk about this on the border. We can talk about this in the public school education, the problem that are going on there, or any of the other corporations that receive public subsidies in Texas. Next slide. So how do we fight back? So this is going to be based on our 10th Amendment, right, which is the powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution, nor prohibited by it to the states, are reserved to the states respectively. And so this is the idea of nullification in a sense. It is the idea of state sovereignty. If we've studied history, we know that I think the best modern day correlation for how the United States was set up would be something similar to the European Union. So the states were supposed to be sovereign nations brought together, the federal government there just to protect individual rights. But Texas was supposed to be different than California and different than Idaho. And if you didn't like Texas, well, you can move to Colorado or California. But we were never supposed to be homogenous. We were supposed to be different and sovereign. This was the original design of the founders. The fight for a free market will be reliant on state policies. I wholeheartedly believe, I don't know if any of y'all believe, that we can actually turn the federal government around. I've lost hope in that. That's why I've spent the last decade in state politics, because I think this is the key. I think we're seeing Florida do that on other policy, specifically something like marijuana policy, for instance. And this is not me advocating for it, but it's just showing the point that I believe it was Colorado, right, who first legalized it. But it is still yet to be removed from a Schedule I or to be deregulated in the federal government. So what is that? That's nullification. That's them saying, nah, we're not going to listen to that. And what has happened after that? State after state after state after state after state has followed suit. And so when, despite the policy, if a state exercises its sovereignty, the federal government basically has two choices: do nothing or bring in troops and enforce the policy. And I don't think the federal government, especially in Texas, wants to come down here and do that to us. And you're seeing, they're not doing anything about Florida, and they're not going to. And if we have brave politicians that are willing to stand up and exercise our state sovereignty, we will be able to push back against the Biden administration and anybody else. And yes. Great question. We've been trying for a long time to do that. I would say, well, I'll get to that. We'll talk about that in the end. So we must hold our state governments accountable. This is typically going to be done through elections. The problem is getting the bad guys out, right? And ultimately, it's going to come down to an educated voter. And honestly, that's one of our biggest problems. Being in elections is most people are not educated voters. And most people make decisions based on name recognition, which is why, and I was talking to Andy earlier, you can't, if you decide to run for office, which by the way, every single person here that decided to run for office, thank you, thank you, thank you. If you do not come out victorious, do not stop. Statistically, it's very rare for someone to beat an incumbent in their first cycle because people recognize name recognition. So I highly encourage you, if you felt called to run for public office, Do not stop. Even if you're defeated in your first cycle, it takes time. Policy takes time. Getting into office takes time. And I think that's one of the biggest barriers is people run, and running for office is stressful. I've never run myself. I've been asked. I said no. I've seen what my boss has gone through. I'm not saying I won't in the future, but it is brutal. It is brutal, and it takes a lot of courage, a lot of money, and a lot of help from people to do that. And so if we feel called to do that, don't give up after the first cycle. I just want to encourage y'all. And if you're toying with the idea, go for it. Go for it. Run for office. I want to encourage you to do that because everyone is thinking the same way. Nobody wants to, I don't want pain. I'm sure a lot of y'all don't want pain. But in order to turn this around, we're going to have some individuals who sacrifice their time and their money and their name in order to fight for freedom. That's what we're missing in our society. Next slide. So obstacles to the free market in Texas. Some of the biggest things I see going on right now. So corporate welfare and subsidies, of course, are a big problem. Taxpayer-funded lobbying, which I mentioned. Occupational licensing, which Abbott a few years ago came out in opposition to, but that just dissolved, and we haven't really done anything. He was actively, as a matter of fact, I think the Freedom Caucus had an amendment that like dissolved the plumbing board or something like that, and Abbott came through with likely unconstitutional executive action and restored it, right? But he has come out in the past, and the 2016, 2017 saying he opposed it, but that has disappeared. Welfare programs, especially for illegals, it happens all the time. There's a number of loopholes that I'd be happy to talk to you all about afterwards that they take advantage of quite often. Funding leftist schools, specifically universities, are a problem. And then, of course, property taxes as well are a big problem. Next slide. So, as I asked earlier, is the government too big? Yes. Why do we allow it to grow at all? We should not. If you ask any conservative politician, any lawmaker, that same question, they're going to give the exact same answer. And so we need to start training ourselves to put them on the spot and ask them questions like this. As a conservative, do you think the government is too big? They have to answer yes if they're going to claim conservative, because I don't know a conservative on this planet that thinks our government is in the ideal size, which my opinion would be so small I can barely see it. But if we concede that the government is too big, then why are we letting it grow at all? We need to actively cut and slash. If something is too big, we don't continue to allow it to grow. If we have debt in our home, and we're $100,000 in debt, and we're trying to turn it around, we don't say, oh, we'll just pile on $10,000 in debt a year, and hopefully it'll work itself out. No, you actually have to tighten your belt, you actually cut your budget, and start actively working against that. But the government, for some reason, doesn't play those rules. Next slide. So, of course, we need a big change in thinking. So, maintaining the status quo is not, you can go back one, it's not a winning strategy. So, conservatives can't accept preventing bad laws as a win. And honestly, even in our office, Stickland's office, one of the things we prided ourselves on was killing bad legislation. And I think we do need to do that. But that is not enough. It is not enough to maintain the status quo, or what I've been saying is playing defense, which is we're just trying to prevent bad things from happening, because all that happens is we keep getting pushed further back, and the left continues to go further left, and that center moves, that Overton window moves, and people who used to be considered Democrat moderates are now considered Republicans. It's because we've been playing defense, and as progressives actively working to change policy, they have been successful. Another thing I would say that I don't think I have on the slide is, I think it was Andrew Breitbart that said that policy is always downstream from culture. And I think this is something that we've been really weak on. I have actually seen, I think the Daily Wire and a few other ones are starting to create content, create media, create entertainment. And that's something as conservatives we've really been bad at. And that's something that leftists have understood, that we did not get to legalizing gay marriage unless the culture changed. And it changed through what? MTV and entertainment, indoctrinating kids. And we have to wise up as conservatives and realize it's not just about going and voting at the ballot box. We have to actively change our culture. I would say the most effective way to do that as a Christian is to share the gospel of Jesus Christ with your neighbors. I believe it is the only thing that can change the heart of a person. And us as conservatives, I was blown away in the Capitol at the amount of conservative Christians who talked about policy constantly, but would never open their mouth about the gospel. And if we're going to expect the culture to change, if we need to change the hearts of people, the only way that I know how is the gospel of Christ, allowing him to change the heart. So I would encourage you, if you're talking to your neighbors about politics, don't forget the thing that matters, that will actually cause our culture to change. Revival is possible. So I want to encourage y'all not only do that, but invest in companies who are trying to do this, trying to change culture, because it's really the only way we're going to change policy. Right now, as we stand, especially on the federal level, if we try and pass policy, our culture just isn't there yet. Or isn't there anymore. We've moved on. And so we have to pivot and start pushing back on culture. And we have to kind of work in both lanes. We have to work for policy, but we also have to work for cultural change as well. Actively, of course, repealing laws. This is shrinking the government. Radically slashing budgets and regulations. We talked about it in the no growth budget. And then holding lawmakers accountable by voting out anyone that does not consistently fight for small government. I will give you my rough estimate. I would say 95% of the time, if you vote against an incumbent, you've done a good thing. Because most of them are not good. Yes?
How are we still under an emergency order?
It's a great question.
What I understand is how we can push back and talk about repealing it when we still allow that to stand. Why can't
I can tell you why. Because there was a push in the legislative session to deal with the emergency powers of the governor, and our legislature refused to do that. And they continued to allow Abbott to exercise the executive overreach that he did during COVID. It is still not ended. There's a number of benefits to keeping an emergency call in place, and that's why. But the reality is we've given our governor too much power, and our representatives in the House and in the Senate just didn't get it done. They knew it is. And it's centralized power, and it's happening in the presidency as well. You know, we have the president making laws and policy, and the governors are following suit. And quite honestly, conservatives are cheering them. They're cheering them and saying, good job, we need it. Maybe not Biden, but we'll cheer an Abbott. We'll cheer other governors who come through and have a strong policy, but completely circumvent the legislative process. And that was never how it was designed to do. So the fault lies on our legislators, because they had, in 2021, after the whole nightmare of COVID, they had the opportunity to rein him in, and they didn't. They didn't. Next slide. So this is kind of wrapping it up. So here is our 2021 fiscal responsibility index metric. So overall average for the House and Senate was 40. That's a failing grade. We do go roughly on, passes 70 or above. The Senate average was 50. This does include Democrats, to be fair. And the House average was 38. It's really bad up there, y'all. And I don't have time to talk about all the conversations I heard from lawmakers, even lawmakers that I consider to be good guys behind the scenes. But we have to hold these guys accountable, and that's mainly going to be through elections, which means we have to invest our time, our energy, and our finances to get this done. It's the only way it's going to get done. Next slide. So Texas Prosperity Plan, we already talked about that at the beginning. I would encourage you to go to our website, sign up for our email. We're not going to spam you. We're not going to sell your information. We have a weekly thing. It probably takes 5 minutes to read, but we will be releasing this along with a video kind of explaining exactly what it is. We have been pushing resolutions in the Republican Party, trying to get as many of these as a priority in the Republican Party as possible. So if you're a delegate, please come talk to me afterwards. But I think that's coming up in about a month and a half. June 14th, I think, is when the state convention is in Houston. We will be there. We will have a booth. I think that might be it. Next slide. So there you go. We're a nonprofit. We do appreciate donations. It is how we run. This is how we serve y'all. If you're able, we would appreciate it. Do we have time for questions? Okay, we have a little time for questions. So anybody have questions? Tell me where I screwed up. Yes, sir.
So I agree with everything you said. But to untangle it, our problem with politics is, say our president goes in, we get whoever the president, right? He's conservative. He's got one term. He tries to do what he's saying, because
Sure.
the American people will not put up with that kind of thing.
Sure.
And that's why I'm not trying to put a negative feel, but what would your answer back to me
I think the example you're using just was an example, right? But I would say, for the most part, conservatives in general pay far more attention to the federal level and who's president in the presidential race than they do on local politics. And I would say specifically the most local, your school boards, your city councils. The closer government is to you, the more effect it has on your life. Who is going to control your property taxes? Well, it's going to be your cities and your counties and your ISDs. I don't know if y'all know this, but they changed the tax code in 2019, and they changed some definitions, one of them being the no new revenue rate. And essentially, simplified, this is the rate in which if we have an increase in revenue, it's the rate at which we can lower it to bring in the same amount of money. We all as conservatives should be showing up to our city councils and our school board and everyone else and demanding that even though you're increasing revenue, we need you to lower that rate, because you come and say, well, we kept the rate the same. I know, but our property taxes are killing us, right? And so I would say, being active, and I got involved in politics in probably 2006, 7, the Obama era, and my focus was completely on the federal level. And the more and more I studied, the more and more, one, I lost faith that even the legislators up there, the House and the Senate, it's a bunch of nonsense. And I would say it's the same in the state, but it's actually changeable in the state. And it's even more changeable in your local elections. I am an advocate for making local elections partisan and uniform. I think it's something we need to start talking about. If we made local elections partisan and uniform, we would take back every single city council and school board almost instantly. I would place my entire life savings on it, because we pretend like they're not partisan. They are partisan. And these secret elections on May 7th that nobody even knows about, if we simply just moved those and allowed primaries to work and added those in November, we would have massive turnout. Most mayor races, especially in smaller, you're talking a couple hundred votes. I've seen mayors win with 700 votes, even in larger cities. And so I would say concentrate on local elections specifically and work your way up. So placing the most importance on your city and local level, working up to the state, and then if you got time, deal with the federal government and the president. Because the reality is, although the president's powers has increased, he has almost no control over our life compared to our local governments. Is that fair? Okay. Any other questions? Yes.
Election, my husband's running for mayor, and we determined that there's a person who's running for council who's a community organizer. She's straight out of San Francisco State.
Mm-hmm.
She's actually picked off a couple of who I thought were conservatives,
Mm-hmm.
and she's got them running circles doing her bidding.
Yeah.
When we check the roll, she goes Democrat. She's a total
Mm-hmm.
libertarian. And it's been really challenging to figure out, what do you do when you have an opportunity? You can't just go on Facebook, well, you call her out, but everybody goes crazy because they think you're being hateful.
Sure, sure.
I'm just curious what the strategy is to do.
Uniform and partisan elections. That's the solution. Because the leftists have been doing this for decades. They're pros at it. And they're fake Republicans. I'm in Fort Worth technically, and of course we had good old Betsy Price, who was not a conservative, and then her chief of staff, Maddie, ran. She got elected after campaigning as a conservative or using conservative language, and then she came out for the transgender agenda, and she came out for all. Okay, this is how it goes. They're smart. They lie, and they do whatever they have to get into office, and they say whatever. We have Democrats who actively cross over and vote in Republican primaries and vote for the lesser of two evils. It's very common. We need reform. We need reform in our elections. We need reform in our primary process, and we certainly need reform in our local elections.
So you can say you're conservative or Republican or Democrat, you just don't.
You can't identify as a party, but we all know the buzzwords, right? And a lot of times we'll see them on signs. But you're not allowed to be partisan in local elections. Yes, sir.
You can get a couple bills that Republicans have passed in Austin that increases your ability to defend your rights.
I can't think of one, quite honestly, unless you have something in your head. Sure.
Where if they would pass a law that says if your rights are
Oh, you're saying one they could pass. I thought you were asking if it was something they have passed.
no, I don't have a better answer than what you just
Okay, I was like, I haven't passed anything. Go ahead.
protect yourself,
Sure.
regardless of your daughter's raped in school or what.
Sure.
They do not give you the legal action. When something bad happens, you say, well, go ahead and
You're right.
But to give you an example, if they would pass a law that says if your rights under the state law or state constitution are violated, you have a certain de facto injury. It would be $2,500.
Sure.
Well, the attorney fees is kind of important.
Yeah.
Does it have to be, if you have more than $2,500 worth of injury, great, because you at least have that.
Sure.
Now that you also can get the attorney to represent you, he can get paid. But for example, like if we were to pass a law say proper labeling of our food, and then you find out you bought something that's GMO in it, you have an individual action.
Sure.
Because right now you have to go to your lieutenant governor or your state legislature. Why can't we demand our legislators to give us an individual action so we can take it to court, whether it's GMO food, tainted products or whatever it have. We're not asking our state legislatures to protect us in that way, so we have an individual action.
Sure. There has been efforts to do that, and specifically the people who lobby for it are tort reform or attorneys, right? Because they stand to benefit from that. Sure.
To limit how much you can.
Sure.
So as hard as it is to win a lawsuit, now you can't get very much, and we think we're saving the doctors of the medical industry.
Sure.
But we're actually hurting the individual action.
Sure. Typically, I would usually argue that anytime we add more to government, I'm usually just against it. I would usually go with let's just demolish the whole thing and make government so small and have almost no say. But I understand there's holes in that.
There's only two people who are against tort reform, me and Kelly Shopper.
Yeah, sounds about right. And they've been trying and trying and trying. But the House and the Senate and the state legislature is every bit as dysfunctional as the federal. Well, we're not. Here's what politicians, in my experience, here's what politicians respond to: pain. Pain. Asking and begging and giving them honey never, ever, ever works. They will tell you what you want to hear. They are sociopaths. They are narcissists for the most part. I'm sorry, I know a lot of these people personally, and they will tell you whatever you want to hear. The only thing they respond to that will make them do something is bringing pain. I'm not talking about being a jerk. I'm not talking about yelling at them. I'm talking about putting the fear that they're going to lose their seats by being active in grassroots. That is the only thing that I've ever seen make significant change to policy. Specifically, one example